So next up, we've got Tilo, who's going to give a deep dive on the state-of-the-art gestures layer that he's been working on.
Thanks. Okay, this is on. Yeah, okay, this is on. All right, sweet. Okay, cool. So we have half an hour till lunch, and a few better ways to spend it than talk about gesture events. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the state of gestures. My name's Tilo. I work on YUI and Peer at Yahoo. Does this work? Hold on. I'll just do this. It's fine. Okay. So yeah, so when I was thinking about the name for this talk, I didn't know what to call it. State of gestures sounds kind of interesting. Thought I'd get more people in the room, so I went with that. But actually, what the talk is about is challenges of developing multi-device user experiences and what we're doing about it here in the YUI team. So multi-device user experiences. Okay, so multiple devices. So I thought a good place to start would be, since we're talking about, different devices, to talk about different types of inputs. One of the things we're seeing now is that, we have different devices, all of which have different interaction patterns. Some use touch, some use mouse, some use both. So I was going to start by kind of diving into this. So let's assume a use case. Let's assume we have this button, the subscribe button, and we want to fast click on it, right? Because we want more people, we feel if this is a responsive button, and by fast click, I mean, how you don't have to wait for that delay on touch devices. So we want this button to be fast clickable. So in the old days, or I say pre-2007 really, most of the things we dealt with were computers which primarily had mouse input, and there was keyboard as well, but primarily people interacted with your site using the mouse. And for that, if we wanted to achieve this sort of fast click effect, this is what we would write. We would say, oh, node, this button dot on click, do something, right? And that was very simple, and it did the job very well. Then, after 2007, the iPhone came out, and it wasn't just the iPhone, but just this, all these touch devices that were entering the market and still are, and that gave us this notion of building sites that have touch support now. And the primary interaction the primary input from users was touch. And it also had some other input types like accelerometer and gyroscope, but we're not going to get into that. Primarily, people were interacting with your site through either mouse or touch. So we as web developers said, okay, all right, we'll take that into account. So let's do something like this. So if we see that this device supports touch events, so window.onTouchStart exists, we're going to use the touch end event because that fires really quickly. And if the device doesn't support touch, then we will fire mouse events. And that seems to work. That's using feature detection too, so that's pretty good. But then the problem is that over the last maybe a year, maybe more than a year probably, but let's say the last 2-3 years, we've had these devices that have crept into the market now which have both mouse and touch functionality. And I'm not saying that these devices weren't there before, but they weren't there in this type of number. And the background picture here is of a Microsoft Surface because that's a common one. Actually, I don't know how common it is, but everyone knows about it. But there's also, the Chromebook Pixel, and I couldn't find a good picture with the Pixel. So anyway, so these types of devices, you can interact with them either through, the mouse, or you can click directly or tap directly on the screen rather, and they send touch events. So going back to the previous snippet I showed you, with the on touch start kind of branching, this no longer works suddenly because what happens is that these new devices, they support touch events, so they'll always go into that if statement, and the else listener will never get called, or actually will never get subscribed. So what happens is if the user interacts with their screen, everything works fine, but as soon as they stop interacting with the screen and they tap on or they click on something, on the keyboard on that device, we have no interaction, nothing works, everything breaks down. So we said, okay, this is the actual thing that you're supposed to do for that case, which is if touch start exists, you actually have to listen to both touch end and mouse up, because you don't know which is going to come in. And then if a touch end comes in, you want to actually prevent default, because if you prevent default, the mouse events don't fire after that. So what you want to do is say, oh, on touch end mouse up, I want to prevent default, and then I want to do something. And this is obviously if you don't want, if it's not a link, you don't want to send the user somewhere. You want them to stay on that same page. So that's okay. But the problem is that's not all you write. Because now what we have is, in devices like the Surface, they have MS pointer events which fire. So you want to say, okay, well, that's fine. But if they support MS pointer, then we're just going to listen to MS pointer events. But then that's actually not all of it either, because then if they just support, if they don't support touch events or MS pointer events, let's just listen to mouse events. And you get to see that this is getting complicated really quickly from that initial 3-line no.on click that we had. And the funny thing here is that those lines of code I showed you is just for a simple, I just want to click on an element and I want that click to be responsive, right? So if that's how complicated it's getting for a simple click, then what are we going to do when we're talking about more complicated gestures? So this is kind of what we've been thinking about in YUI. And the other thing I showed you earlier, which was the prevent default to prevent mouse events from coming in after, is very heavy-handed. It's fine if you use that in your application, but in YUI, we can't, a frame or a library shouldn't prevent default for you by default, because we don't know if you want to prevent default or not. So the whole notion of prevent default is kind of heavy-handed. We don't really want to go down that route unless we need to. So these are some of the problems, right, with this whole idea of gestures and having something that works everywhere. So now that I've kind of cleared that up. Oh, side note. So if you go to this link, I'm going to go here right now. This is how you can actually check to see what events your browser fires. So yeah, you guys can see that. Okay. I don't know why this link isn't working. Let me scale this up. So yeah, if you go on this link here, this JS bin, this is kind of how I did my testing initially, is as you interact with this kind of square up here, you get the events that are firing, and you see by default Chrome is firing mouse down, mouse up, click. And what I do usually is to simulate that Microsoft Surface kind of device that supports both mouse and touch. I actually open up the Chrome inspector. I go into this little settings icon down here, and I click enable, and I check off emulate touch events down here. I don't know if you guys can see that. It's a little small. Let's see if I can, yeah. Check off that emulate touch events, and then you have to keep the debugger open or the inspector open, but your mouse turns into this little touch fingery thingy, and now if you interact with it, you get touch events and mouse events that fire. So just side note, this is how I kind of debug to make sure my sites work well in both touch and mouse interactions. Cool. So if you did that, if you wanted that JS fiddle and you did that for like a bunch of different browsers, this is basically what you would get. On desktops, as you saw in like something like Chrome or Firefox, you usually get mouse down, mouse move, mouse up, click. I'm assuming that you're clicking on an element here. On iOS, you just get touch events. So you just get touch start, touch move, touch end, and then click if the touch start and touch end was on the same element. The click fires 300 milliseconds later because iOS checks to see if you're doing a double tap. That's why that's the whole problem. Like, that's why we want responsive buttons, because if we just subscribe to clicks, it would fire after 300 milliseconds. On Android, this is on a 4.0. It actually fires both touch and mouse events. The touch events come in first, then followed by the mouse events. So touch start, mouse down, touch move, touch end, mouse up, and then a click. And then on IE10 Plus, IE10 Plus supports MS pointer events. So they actually fire simultaneously. So you get a pointer down, MS pointer move, MS pointer up, mouse up, and then a click. So as you can see, the idea I wanted to show here is that there are different environments and they kind of work differently. So with kind of that background in place, I was thinking about how to best approach this problem. And if we take a step back and talk about responsive web design, which is kind of this big buzzword that we're using for everything these days, primarily when we talk about responsive web design, what we're talking about is HTML and CSS. HTML and then media queries or something like that to make your site look good in all screen sizes. But is there like a JavaScript component behind responsive web design as well? That's a question that we had on the team. And if you actually break down the word responsive web design and you look at the word responsive means quick to react or respond, which if you think about it, is pretty much what we were trying to do with that button earlier. We're trying to make a button that is responsive across different devices. So it seems to fit. And the idea, obviously, is that right now with all those code snippets that I showed you, in all of them, the events I was listening to were very closely coupled with the input type, right? It was a mouse event or a touch event or an MS pointer event. Well, not MS pointer so much, but definitely mouse and touch. So the idea must be to decouple these events from their inputs. Something like this, most likely. So no matter how what input causes that event to fire, we want to fire some event. It could happen because of a finger, it could happen because of a mouse, it could happen because of a pen or something else. And then your application should listen to that event. And if this is firing some light bulbs, then it should, because this is basically what the pointer specification is about, right? It's a W3C specification that says basically this. I shall quote. A pointer can be any point of contact on the screen made by a mouse cursor, pen, touch, including multi-touch, or other pointing input device. This model makes it easy to write sites and applications that work well no matter what hardware the user has. So that's kind of what the pointer spec was, basically saying that regardless of what kind of input you're using, we're going to fire pointer events. So that sounds great. That's exactly what we needed, right? So do we write a polyfill for this in the library? What do we do? A polyfill, obviously, for those who don't know, is kind of simulating that functionality when it doesn't exist natively in the browser. So the polyfill was one idea, but actually my question was, why don't we improve the gesture move events that we have in the library? And you guys might know about the gesture move events. Personally, I kind of knew they existed, but I never used them because they weren't very useful. But that was a question I had. And the reason I had this question is because if you look at the gesture move docs, this is what they say. Gesture move start, gesture move, and gesture move end are events that serve as abstractions over mouse and touch events, forking internally based on client device, which sounds exactly like what the pointer spec says, basically. So there's clearly a disconnect because we have this thing in the library and we've had it for a while, yet we're probably not making use of it because it hasn't received love in a while and it hasn't kind of, we haven't worked on it as all these specs have developed. So what we basically want is something like this, and this is what we've been working on. Regardless of what type of input is what kind of event comes in, whether it's a touch event or a mouse event or an MS pointer event, gesture move events fire now in the library, right? So this was the case before too, but we've kind of gone in and made it work better for cases where touch and mouse events are both firing. You don't want gesture move start to fire twice, right? Once for touch start, once for mouse down. So we've done some work there. So now you can kind of listen to these three events, and they're abstractions over the lower level browser DOM events. But we didn't really stop there. What we really want you guys to listen to is higher level, richer events, right? So we have this richer set of events that are built on top of this gesture layer. Events like tap, flick, moving. So if you hold your finger down or your mouse down and you actually move the mouse around, it'll fire the mouse or the finger is actually moving across the page. And transforms, which is something I'm working on. And then your application listens mostly to the richer set of events because that tells you what you need. If you want to, you can also listen to the gesture move layer, but you don't really have to. So that architecture is kind of what we're going towards, and we've already done a lot of work towards it. There's a pull request 1309 that has improvements to event move to make it work for mouse and touch and devices that support both, kind of what I was saying. And for the common use case, the one I mentioned earlier, the fast clicking on a button, we already have that because we improved event tap a few months ago, and we added support for prevent default. So you can now tap, and a tap is basically a fast click regardless of where you are. So you can say button.on tap and e.prevent default because I don't want the page to change, and then do whatever you want, and that'll work. I'll give you a demo soon. And not only that, but we actually have a whole bunch of new APIs that are coming that I wanted to show to you guys. So tap, like I said, we've been working on that. It's already out there. We have support for dual listeners, which means that it works really well on devices that support both mouse and touch. So you can go on a surface, you can tap on it with your finger, then you can go back and tap on it with your mouse. Everything will work really well. Has prevent default support. That's available right now. I think it was out in 3.10 or something. So Flick, we've added, or we're adding rather, new sugar events on top of Flick. So you can now flick up, flick left, flick down, and flick right. So it's kind of nice because you don't have to like figure out which way the flick is going. And flick, obviously, its API, when the event payload comes in, you get a direction of the flick and the velocity, which is in pixels per second. Basically, like when someone's flicking, the touch move and mouse move events are firing, and you want to see like how much what was the displacement over how long the flick lasted. So you get this nice velocity that comes in. Those flick up, flick down, flick left, and flick right events are in pull request 1323, which we're kind of ironing out. It's almost there. And then gesture move start, as I mentioned, pull request 1309 has support for this the new improvements that we've been making to it. And there are some other things that I have not made it into that pull request yet, but basically support for delta. So delta X and delta Y, I call it. What this does is lets you, let's say if you tap on the screen or something, right? I'm just going to assume you're using a finger. But let's assume you tap on the screen, so a gesture move start event fires. And then you move, you start moving your finger, and then you let go of the screen. So what happens is we actually calculate the delta between the end and the start to tell you, like, this is how much your finger actually moved. It's not calculating, like, the moves, but just saying, okay, this is the total delta that finger moved. And you can do really interesting things with that, and I'll show you that in the demo. So we have this concept of delta X and delta Y. And then these move events, it's kind of confusing, gesture, move, star, and move. We're kind of still ironing out these names. They might change. But when I talk about the move events, what I'm talking about are this higher level set of events when you put your finger on a page and you start moving it on the page, you get these move events that fire. And these move events, you can subscribe to move up, move down, move left, and move right. So you can say, only tell me when someone holds their finger down and starts moving left, right? And you have the ability to lock axis. So you can say, let's say, you want to put your finger on something, and you want to say, if they move left or right, prevent default. But if they move up and down, don't prevent default, because I want the page to be scrollable, like naturally, like vertically, right? So you can only fire move events in a specific direction. And this payload also has a direction property and delta X and delta Y. So that's also really useful. The delta X and delta Y tells you if I start moving, between move n-1 and move n, like, how much did they go in the X, how much did they go in the Y? So are they going up and down, left or right? What are they doing? And I will show you that in demo. So I keep talking about this demo, so I'll show you the demo, right? So I'll actually start it on the computer first, so. Cool, so you can see that, okay. So I have this carousel here, and it's using these gesture events. Basically, this carousel has, so I have a custom build of YUI, which I'll send a link to. It has these new APIs inside it. Now this carousel has 3 event subscriptions on it. It has subscription for flicking, left and right. It has a subscription for dragging or moving, so kind of like that. And then it has a subscription for tapping on these little, I don't know if you can see those things there. So this looks, because I figured that on the desktop, people, like this whole flick concept, I don't feel it's natural. People don't like flicking with a mouse. So on a desktop, you can kind of tap through this. Oh, that's the last one, actually. And then this is the real cool part. Can we get the Elmo working, or power? Oh, it was already on. Give me a second. Thanks. Is that up somewhere? Okay, cool. Okay, cool. So you guys can kind of see that. So this is a really kind of pretty much native scrolls that you can get here. What's basically happening is, I'll kind of show you what's happening under the hood. When I'm tapping and I'm moving this, I'm using the delta X of the of the move event, and the delta X here is kind of like the amount of the next photo that you can see. This is the delta X, because this is saying that I've moved from here that much, right? So the next photo is revealed by that much. And then it's a CSS transform that's applied that's kind of giving this sort of animated effect. And on these little arrows on the left and right, I have event tap set up. So you can see I can kind of like fast click through these, and they work really well. And then if I flick, that's the last one. if I flick, the flick left and flick right events allow me to kind of go back and forward through the carousel. And I have this little, like some smarts in here, which basically says if I start dragging, but the delta is not enough, is not a sufficient amount, then just, when I let go, just go back to the current pane basically. So the delta is like let's say half, it'll go to the next one. If the delta if it's not, then it'll just stay where it's at. So yeah, I'll send a link to where this lives so you can try it out. So the cool part is, so I think that's cool. Can we move back to the computer? Okay, cool. So the cool part is that, as you can see, it kind of works the same way on the computer. And let's do the same thing I did before, which is that little inspector trick to get the mouse events, the touch events on here. Exact same thing, right? So I'm not listening for any touch start mouse down, I'm not doing any funky things, but it's just working. So let me explain to you what's happening here. So this is what we do now. Like without these new APIs and this new like gesture kind of sugar layer that we're kind of working on, if you were to create this now, this is pretty much what you would do, and I've tried to do this. You would set up some gesture move star and flick listeners. You would actually, when on gesture move start, so on touch down, you would store the page X and page Y values. I'm going to call them X1 and Y1. So you're going to store those values somewhere, and then you're going to compare that to gesture move, to the page X and page Y that you get from gesture move to figure out what the direction and delta is, because we don't give you that. And then on gesture move end, so when you lift your finger up, you're going to compare that again to the ones that you said before to figure out what the direction delta is there. And then you're going to have these big callback functions where you're going to branch logic based on direction. And after you do all that, you got to figure out, okay, well, how does this work on devices that support both mouse and touch, but it doesn't fire twice, and it's like stricter than you think. And you haven't really gotten to coding the actual interaction, like the actual application. This is just setting stuff up. So with the new APIs, what you do is you listen for move, flick left, flick right, and gesture move end. Inside the move callback, you get the necessary information using e.drag.direction and e.drag.deltax. Actually, don't quote me on the property names there, because they might change. That's just what I'm using now. Probably change something else. Probably like e.gesture or something. And then you transition to previous and next panels inside your flick left and flick right callbacks. And inside gesture move end, you get the delta x from the and direction x, directs properties, and you decide whether or not to transition panel. So already you can see you're kind of working at a higher level here, and you're already thinking about transitioning and not setting up, like figuring out what direction is and what all that stuff is. So going forward, this is where everything actually lives. So I mentioned the two pull requests. I have a branch called gesture integration, which actually has a build of all of these modules. That's where that demo was working from. And the demo itself, you can check the code for it in that bit.ly link, which is a gist. You can like run that with raw GitHub or something, which is what I was doing. So yeah, check it out and let me know what you think. I'm pretty excited about this stuff. I think it's adds some very necessary sugar to make it easier for you guys to code gesture events across devices. That's all I had. Thanks.
So we have some time for questions. Do you have any questions from the audience? Oh, here we go.
Hey, it's more like a curiosity than other thing. In iOS 7, Apple decided to put the back and forth within the Safari. I was wondering if you find anything interesting there playing with all those events. If you find a way or somehow to circumvent the problem that we're swiping.
Yeah, you know what? I haven't. I tried to prevent default on touch start. It didn't prevent those events from that behavior. But for example, in the demo that I showed, I can show it to you in person. Like you'll be able to play around with it. On the phone, I actually those events still work, but the width in which they work, like it's not that bad. Like I haven't prevented default. It doesn't change the way the flick works. You can still normally just flick through left and right. You don't really need to prevent default. Personally, I don't think you should prevent default because ever since I got iOS 7, I've been using that thing to go back and forward like very often. So short answer, I haven't figured out a way to get rid of it, but it hasn't gotten my way.
Do you have any more questions?
There's one over here.
All right.
Hey there.
Hey.
Can you explain a little bit more the thoughts about how to think about whether you'd use the gesture move series of events versus the move series of events that you went over?
Yeah, so the move actually, originally, like, they're actually drag events, and that's a better way of thinking about them. The reason I'm running into problems calling them drag because they conflict with the DOM drag events that fire in HTML5. So still figuring out the best way of what to call them. Originally, I also called them gesture drag, but it sounded like, I don't know, it sounded weird. So if you think about them as drag events, it might make more sense because, and to be honest, I think the gesture move events might, like, we could consider renaming them to like some sort of pointer or something like that. The reason we didn't go with the pointer initially, or at least I was hesitant, is because the MS point or the pointer specification has a dependence on a CSS property called touch action, and we don't support the touch action property. So if someone thought this was like conforming to the spec 100%, it's not. But yeah, think about the move events that I mentioned as drag events, pretty much. Yep.
It's just a little question about how to replace the double-click event that we have on the YUI grid with these gestures.
The what event, sorry?
Double-click.
Oh, yeah, so I think going forward, what we want to do is build up that, like double click or like hold, or these are like richer events. And we want to kind of build those into this new layer, like just how tap and flick are there now. We want to have like double tap or something like that probably, which will work, you know, it'll work for tapping choice, it'll work for clicking choice, it'll work on devices that support both. So we're going to, I think after we get this initial pass through, go in and add those events in or make them work well by relying on this gesture move layer that we're kind of building out.
We have time for a couple more questions.
We have one more by Ryan.
All right. Make me run.
I just wanted to make Andrew run over here.
Oh.
So I probably should have looked at the PR, so I should already know this, but I haven't, so I'm sorry. How do you differentiate when a drag event starts between whether it's an MS pointer that's starting it or where it's a touch device or a mouse device? Because on touch, often you want to like touch and hold a bit and then you start a drag event as opposed to just touching and making a gesture.
So the drag event basically, it correlates pretty much with the move, with like a touch move or a mouse move, but you can specify, you can kind of specify this is how, to be honest, that's basically what it is. Like it correlates to a touch move and a mouse move. It's not exactly like a DD drag or something like that. It just says that I'm moving while in like my fingers down, or I'm moving over the element with my mouse. So I'm not sure. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, do you have any more questions? Okay.
Have you guys? Hi. Have you guys done any work on the around the interaction with trackpads? Because one of the things that, and I know that there are some limitations there, but one of the things that, you know, when you're using, like, let's say Google Maps, for example, that's like kind of frustrating is if you're used to using tablets,
Yeah.
and you're scrolling,
Yeah.
and then you go to Google Maps, you can't, like, for example, move the map like with a swipe.
Oh, right.
Because it's doing the swipe like at a higher level or whatever. But I was just wondering if you guys had, you know, put any thought into that stuff or done any work around those kinds of things.
Personally, like I have not, but the problem is that a lot of those events, the browser, sorry, not the browser, the like trackpad related events correlate very strongly with the OS. In fact, if you like go into system preferences and you look at those trackpad events, like if you click on the trackpad link, it says, oh, you know, swipe with 4 fingers to go to the next, you know, whatever they call it in Mac, the next like screen or whatever. So I feel it'd be confusing for users if we I don't even know if it's possible. If it is, like, you could definitely have a 4-finger gesture, but I feel bad about preventing default on these sort of paradigms because less like tech savvy users know that for like a pinch is normally a zoom on a pinch on the trackpad is normally a zoom in the browser, right? So I feel weird about if we change that, unless it's like it's like a web app that's doing that or something. So I haven't had any experience, but I don't know. I don't know if I want to necessarily overwrite all those events because they're OS level sort of stuff.